This is Pair of Hand, and you are listening to the Pair of Hand Show. What's up, everybody? It's me, your host, Pair of Hand. Thank you for listening. We have an amazing show for you tonight, so you're going to want to stay tuned. If you haven't already, please hit the like and subscribe button and continue to support what we do here on the Pair of Hand Show. So Spider-Man is literally a week away from coming out, and I am excited. I can't wait to see what they do with the new Spider-Man movie and bringing the Spider-Verse and these other Spider-Man movies into the new MCU universe. From what I'm hearing, this may potentially be the last of Tom Holland's Spider-Man. And we see possibly the new MCU universe hand Spider-Man back to Sony Pictures, in which they are going to make a sequel to Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man. And from my understanding, is what we'll see in this new movie is an older Peter Parker, in which he's aged. And now he is taking on a whole new set of challenges where he has to deal with being an older Spider-Man. His powers are starting to fade. He now has a family with children, and he has to try and balance being Spider-Man, being a family man. And does he continue on being Spider-Man or pass on the torch to someone new? And from what I'm hearing, this is going to be the new Spider-Man movie, which is interesting because we haven't yet seen an aged Spider-Man. All the Spider-Man movies we've seen have been a young Spider-Man and him becoming Spider-Man essentially and dealing with this as a teenager. But could you imagine Spider-Man dealing with aging, getting older, and now he has all the problems of a person who has a family and a home and responsibilities, and he's no longer this teenager, and he now has to deal with being Spider-Man. And does this affect his powers? Like, what happens to Spider-Man as he gets older? Does he start to lose his powers? Do they become amplified? This will be an interesting take because we'll be able to see finally what happens to Spider-Man as he gets older, and can he continue being Spider-Man? Now, from my understanding too, is that there was this deal between Sony and Marvel that they could continue to make 2 more movies, in that they would end with a final movie that would allow them to pivot off of that movie and create a new Sony movie. Now, does this mean that Tom Holland's Spider-Man, will he die in this next movie? Because that's, I think, is a possibility. And when you look at the trailer, you see him talking about having to make choices. And are those choices potentially, does he have to decide between his life and MJ's? Or does he have to decide between his life and the villains that have been thrown into the other, into his universe? It'll be interesting to see what happens to him. Or does he potentially become the new Iron Man, from what I've heard a lot of people talking about that. Some people believe that he may take over for Tony Stark, and that the reason we seen him and Tony Stark have such a strong friendship in the original Marvel movies is because he was grooming him to be his predecessor. And maybe he no longer wants to be Spider-Man anymore, but this allows him to be Iron Man. And we could see a potentially new Iron Man who not only has this iron suit, but at the same time has these superpowers to contribute to this suit as well, and we see a potentially very powerful, new character. And what's interesting about this is if they take Tom Holland and they turn him into Iron Man, right? Well, they own the rights to Iron Man, so they could continue on the story and create a whole new storyline with him as Iron Man and still allow Sony Pictures to do their Spider-Man movies. So I think this is a good possibility that we could see Tom Holland transition over into Iron Man and then see a new Spider-Man. And I think that the Marvel movies could do all right without Spider-Man. And essentially they would have Spider-Man, but as the new Iron Man. And I think eventually you have to transition into new, younger characters. And potentially this has been the youngest character in the Marvel movies. So he becomes the leader of the new Marvels, of the new team, and sets forth new movies that they can continue on and keep that same energy. So it'd be interesting to see what happens with that. I've always been a big multiverse fan, a fan of the multiverse theory, and I've often wondered, do we potentially from time to time slip into other multiverses? Are there other dimensions of time and space in which we've merged with? And this is why we see things like the Mandela effect. I heard a very interesting story one time. I'd spoken with this gentleman on a long bus ride one time. And this man had a nice long conversation with me and told me a very strange, interesting story. He was from Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and he had lived there for about 10 years, and he said he lived in this older home, and that one day he was sitting at home, and all of a sudden he heard a knock at his door. And when he opened the door, there was this man in a trench coat, sort of tattered jeans, old shoes. He had long brown hair and a big bushy beard. And he felt sort of very ominous. And this guy said to him at the door, "Hey, I used to live in this house. And I left something down in the basement that I hid down there. And when I moved out, I forgot to grab it. Can I come back in and get this thing that I left down in the house? And it's very important to me. I need to get it." Well, this older man, he felt very uncomfortable with allowing some stranger into his home that he had never met. And he felt like this would be an unsafe situation. So he was basically like, you know what? You tell me where it is. I can get it for you and give me your information, and I can call you and set it up to where I can mail it to you. But I don't really feel comfortable with you coming to my home. I don't think it's a good idea. I'm very sorry, but we can do that. Well, this guy was very upset, did not want to do that, and he says, you know what, never mind, forget about it. So the guy leaves, and about 3 days later, the guy returns back to his house and says, "Hey, can I please go down in your basement? I just want to get this thing that's down there. It's very important to me, and then I promise you'll never hear from me after that." And the old man says, "I told you already. I'll get it for you, but I'm not going to let you into my house." And after a while of the guy pleading with him, eventually the guy says, okay, and then leaves. Now, after this guy leaves, he basically says, okay, this is very weird. I wonder what the guy has put down in the basement. And I wonder what he's hidden down there. So he goes down to the basement and he begins to search for something that this guy may have hidden. And that's when he discovers a brick that was on a pillar of the foundation that looked like the grout had been sort of chiseled out, and it looked like the brick could come out. So he pulls this brick out, and inside he finds sort of a compass, a couple pieces of letters that are in a strange language he can't decipher, and a scope, and a couple other things. So he thinks, oh, this is very odd. I feel kind of bad because maybe this was what the guy was looking for, and it wasn't anything weird. This meant something to him. So he decides to look up the previous owners and figure out who had lived there before to see if he can get in contact with this guy to give him his stuff. So he goes and he looks up this guy, or looks up the previous owners, and finds out that the previous owners were this couple who had lived there for 40 years. And he reaches out to them and calls them. And the couple says, hey, or he says to the couple, someone came to my house and said they had left something in the home that was down in the basement. I found it, and I wanted to return it to whoever the stuff may belong to. And the couple says, I don't know what you're talking about. We live here in Florida. We've never been back to that home. There's nothing in the basement we wanted. They didn't seem to know who this guy was. And he thought, well, that's very odd because he had lived in the home 10 years. They lived in there 40 years. So basically, this guy had looked like he was in his 40s. So it didn't make sense that he could have lived ever in the home. Or he started to realize maybe this guy hadn't actually ever been inside the house, which was very strange. So he goes to a professor at the University of Wisconsin and asked them if they could decipher these 3 pages of papers that he found. And they said, we've never seen anything like this. We don't know what language this is. This just doesn't make sense because it's like bits and pieces of various languages. Hebrew, Greek, Chinese, Mandarin, and there was many different languages that were written down and kind of pieced together in this letter. And he said, we've never seen anything quite like this. And what's very odd is that this man never came back, and he spent several years trying to track this guy down and couldn't even find any existence of this person or that he had ever actually lived in that home. So he could never find this person and any proof that this person had even lived inside the home. So he said that, he thought that it was just very strange that this man claimed that he had lived there, that he returned one day and then never returned again. And I often wondered, did this person live in that home but in alternate reality or in another dimension of space and time in which that was his home, and that he hid some stuff there and it transferred over into this world? I don't know. It's just a very weird story that stood with me, and I still remember this older man telling me the story, and I was very amazed by this. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. It reminds me a lot of the story of the man of Torrid, who was this man who appeared one day in an airport and basically before he got through the checkpoint at the airport, he had to show credentials. And when he showed his credentials, it was from this place called Torrid, which there is no such place, no country or city that's ever existed called Torrid. And he had all these credentials and IDs and all this strange money and strange books and things with him. And they couldn't figure out where this guy had come from. They tried to fingerprint him. They tried to identify him. They tried to track him on the flight. They could not figure out where this man had come from. It was just as if he had appeared out of nowhere. So they began trying to investigate this case. And in the meantime, they put him up in a hotel. And within the next several days of him being at the hotel and being guarded heavily by authorities, he somehow managed to disappear out of the hotel and slip away and completely vanished. And they never found this guy again. And it's just a very odd case in which this person believed that he was from this place. He had identification from this place. He had books that didn't make sense. He hit dates and times and events that had happened that hadn't happened. So was this a man from another dimension, or perhaps another point in space and time that merged upon our universe? And this often plays into the Mandela effect, where people say they remember things one way and then they find out it's completely different. And is these coincidences merely the emergence of 2 points in time? Well, next I want to talk about this. As a child, I grew up, when I was younger, we didn't really have television. You know, it's interesting to think about that, but we didn't have TV. You know, if you didn't have cable when I grew up, you know, because I grew up early 90s, if you didn't have cable, you know, then all you got were basically a couple stations on the local television, and there was nothing ever on. And it was very hard to actually get those stations to come in on the TV. You had these big, huge rabbit ears, and you had to adjust them just to get good reception to watch anything on the TV. So there was nothing to watch if you didn't have cable. And you kind of lived in the dark ages, you know, because you didn't have tablets. You didn't have cell phones. You know, we didn't have a lot of entertainment. We had video game systems like N64, or not N64, the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo and stuff. But these were so expensive. Like, most parents at the time were like, you know, we don't see like a justification for spending this much money on an entertainment system. So really, you know, you had to get creative. You had to figure out things to do with your time. It was a very different time. And I remember growing up without TV, essentially, because we didn't have cable, and none of my friends had cable. So we had to get very creative. And one thing I got into was radio. And I'd listen to a lot of radio shows on the radio. And I'd listen to a lot of stations on the AM. And I started listening to these cassette tapes called Adventures in Odyssey. And they were basically a radio theater show. And you kind of had a picture in your mind, you know, what the characters were and who they look like and what the place looked like and everything. But to me, that was our entertainment. And so at nighttime, you know, instead of putting on TV, we turned the lights off. We put on an Adventures of Odyssey cassette tape with my friend, and we'd listen to Adventures in Odyssey. And that was our entertainment, like I said. But this was a really neat show, and like, it was a Christian-based theme show, but I think that really anybody could get behind it because it had such great stories and a good storyline, great characters, and a lot of good mysteries and stuff. And there was mysteries, and there was a lot of life examples and stuff like that. But I mean, it was just a really cool show, and it felt like you was listening to something that you could pay attention to for a long period of time. But I was just thinking about it the other day, like how crazy some of the episodes were when this was, aimed towards children, and young adults. Like children specifically, I should say, more so than young adults even. And there was some episodes where it was pretty creepy, pretty crazy, and kind of scary, borderline, terrify you in your boots. And I remember one specific episode. It was called, I think it was called something Cauldrons and, but I can't, Cauldrons or something like that. But it was a episode about where this boy, Jimmy Barkley, he played his cousin, or actually what the story was, his cousin had came to town, and this Jimmy Barkley boy had started playing this game with his cousin, and his cousin's like, don't tell your adults about this, don't tell the parents about this, keep this a secret. And they start playing this game, and it got very dark, and they started casting spells and calling on evil spirits and stuff like that. And the boy, Jimmy Bartley, he actually gets possessed. And, as a kid, that's really terrifying, And you hear this boy playing this game, and all of a sudden he gets possessed because he plays this game. And, I remember I had to turn that episode off several times because it just terrified me so badly where I didn't want to listen anymore. And just the part about him getting possessed was very creepy because you hear his voice and you hear that scary element in which you always, think if I play this game or I do this, could that happen to me? And I think for a lot of people that listen to that terrified them. They didn't want to play board games or certain games because they were worried about that. But I thought it was interesting how they had potentially made this episode about where this boy gets possessed by playing a game. And it's funny because my friend's mom was very much like that, and she would tell us, be careful with certain games what you allow in, because you allow this bad energy in, and it can control your life and it could take you over. And I remember there was that whole Pokemon craze that when the Pokemon came out, there was a lot of people that were playing Pokemon, and my friend and I, we got into it and we were obsessed with it. We would fall asleep with Pokemon cards, or we'd, Pokemon action figures, and we would play that video game sometimes 24 hours straight, not go to bed, play all day and all night long. I'd sit in his bedroom for 24 hours just playing Pokemon. And I remember just kind of how obsessed we came, and thinking back to it, you would consider it almost like a disorder, you had an addiction, and it was like it just kind of drawed us in, and it kind of took us over. And I remember that's all we did was want to play Pokemon, and we became completely consumed by it. And I remember I would dream about Pokemon, and my thoughts and ideas just started all becoming Pokemon. And I found myself almost having a hard time to keep up with reality, because I would get lost in this other realm of Pokemon, which is interesting. But it was just like, it was very terrifying because, you'd be trying to have a conversation with someone. And all I kept thinking about was my next move on the Pokemon game. Who would I evolve and who would I catch and who, what would I do next on the game? And I couldn't focus on anything. And my grades slipped and stuff. And I was playing it in school and I was playing it at night. And my friend's mom, commented to us and said, you guys are becoming too involved in this. This is taking over your life. And, she explained to us how, these things can consume you and it can lead to a lot worse things, to evil things happening in your life. And I think that really terrified me and opened my eyes, because after that, I kind of broke away from it and I decided not to play it anymore. And later on in life, many years later, I played this game and it felt very different. It felt very ominous. And when I started realizing it, I thought, maybe there is something to this, because this is very dark. It does feel like it's trying to lure you in, like it's trying to get your attention. And, when you look back at these adventures and odysseys, it was always to teach you a lesson at the end of the day. And you would listen to it and you didn't even realize you were learning a lesson. But I think the interesting thing was that it was trying to teach you something. And that's the thing with these games, essentially, is that there are certain games and things that can draw you in that take so much of your time. And it's interesting because I have a lot of friends that play Magic the Gathering, and I'm not trying to hate against anyone or be mean towards anyone, but a lot of friends that play Magic the Gathering, and you see how much of financially it consumes them. They spend all their money on this game. They spend all their time playing this. A lot of these people that play this have families, and they'd rather spend time playing this game than with their families. And they become so consumed in it. And it's almost like it's luring them in. And it's a very scary appeal that something could draw the attention of someone so much that it would take them away from reality. And you see this, and it's almost like seeing an addict, because you see how drawn into this stuff that they actually get. And it's very terrifying and very crazy when you see how much time and money they actually spend on these games, and the fact that they would miss family engagements, and that they put off their family, and about 5 or 6 days a week after their jobs they're playing these games, or they're playing them at their jobs, and to see that addiction and that draw, you can understand the power that these games have. And so I think we have to be very careful with it. And I think people want to say, that was hating on Dungeons and Dragons. And I don't think necessarily it's hating on anything specifically like these games, Dungeons and Dragons. And I heard a lot of people ask that question, because I play Dungeons and Dragons, or I play Pathfinder, or I play Magic the Gathering, does that mean I'm going to get possessed? And I don't think that was the message. I think the message is that be careful, because these games can lure you in and draw you in and create an addiction into which it consumes your life and becomes very bad, because it can ruin your life. So I think it's something that you have to be very careful with.